I've been to a lot of funerals. It's really part of being a pastor. Over the years, I've been to funerals with just a few people in attendance. I've been to funerals where the lines are out the door for hours, people coming to the visitation. You can't get everyone into the funeral home for the actual service. One of the things that I realized over the years was that your funeral, in many ways, communicates the type of person you were, how you lived. That is, it's a way to measure the impact that you had. Now, I realize it's a subjective means of measure. Someone could have had a significant impact and not a lot of people showed up, but it's a very simple way, I think, in my own mind that I've been able to measure this, to try to think through it as I see people coming for hours and hours and hours, walking through a line to pass along their condolences, to let the surviving family members know that they're grieving with them, they're praying with them. I've seen funerals where there's only 2 or 3 people that show up. I've seen them where there's hundreds. We've seen them on TV where there's literally thousands of people who fill the streets for the funeral of somebody notable. In fact, wasn't too long ago, we saw somebody fairly famous who died. We saw people grieving, crying, weeping, people who'd never met this individual. Realized they had had some sort of impact on their life. Even if ever so superficial, it appeared that they were impacted nonetheless. We come to the funeral of Jesus, though, and just a couple people there. It's hurried. It's rushed. The text tells us because of the day of preparation, they laid Jesus' body there. Now, for us, we may just gloss over that in the English. We don't really realize the impact of the narrative, but we see there's a if you will, a hurriedness, a rushing just to get him in there as quick as possible so that they don't violate the Jewish law, which would have been to have a body hanging on a cross during the day of preparation. But I also believe that there is something else here. As we've read through John's gospel, we find that John uses every activity, every action, every actor, every player, every participant to communicate his message. And the simplicity, the shortness, the brevity, we find John communicating a message. We might even say this is John's eulogy. And we're going to have to take a step back and work through the text so that we can see this, so that we can understand what's being communicated. Because many of us want to do this. We want to go from the crucifixion and we want to leapfrog to the resurrection. We don't want to talk about the burial. Yet when we hear Paul talking about the gospel that had been delivered to him in 1 Corinthians 15, as he tells that church, verses 3 and 4, that the gospel was that Jesus died according to the Scriptures, was buried, and rose according to the Scriptures. See, his burial and that tomb, which would later be the empty tomb, are significant. This is John's eulogy. In these few verses, John's going to communicate a message that he's been communicating throughout the gospel, that Jesus is a king. Now, if we measure Jesus' funeral by the same subjective means that I have measured funerals, we would say he wasn't very significant. Doesn't look very kingly. We would expect a king's funeral to have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of mourners around the world. It would be televised everywhere. You'd see parades and pomp. You'd see weeping, flowers, mourners everywhere. But in the last few moments before the day of preparation hits, we find this hurried, rushed burial. But we're reminded in John chapter 1, this is why we read the gospel straight through, of who the one is they're burying. This is the one who was in the beginning with God, and was who in the beginning was God. This is the one in whom the beginning all things were made through him. He's being buried. Most stories end here. Isn't that what a funeral is? A certain finality. It's the conclusion of a life. The story's over. You go back to the church building, you eat fried chicken, potato salad, and you go home. You say, you shouldn't make light of this matter. Well, I've been watching you all for years do this very thing, so it's you, not me. John's eulogy is this: Jesus is a king. Now, when we come to the text, though, we should be surprised, should we not? I mean, didn't we just read a few chapters ago? Peter says basically, look, that he would never deny Jesus, that he would fight to the end. In fact, he tries to, and that's short-lived. They're all gone. I mean, I would expect the list of the who's who of the early church. I would expect that we would find John, Peter, James, maybe a few others stand there saying, no, this is our responsibility. We'll take care of this. We're introduced to two secret disciples, though. Two unexpected pallbearers show up to the funeral. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Imagine, if you will, this is the first time you've heard this story. This is the first time you've read the gospel. Now, you've read through, you've heard these names before. These are not the folks that you imagined burying Jesus. The story has taken somewhat of a peculiar turn, at least humanly speaking. That is, if we're simply reading it linearly, that is, we're looking at it historically. Certainly it is a historical narrative. This actually happened. But we need to take a step back and understand these events are unfolding throughout eternity, that this was God's preordained plan, that every single element was preordained and providentially unfolding. Therefore, everything that's happening is communicating the same message. So let's talk about these individuals. First of all, Joseph of Arimathea. Now, we're told in the other Gospels that he was a rich man. Well, I think that should be obvious. He has a tomb right there in Jerusalem, so he's probably a resident of Jerusalem. We're also told that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Now, that's interesting because both Joseph and Nicodemus are members of the Sanhedrin. Now, if you remember, the Sanhedrin basically, not only are they the religious elite, they're the religious council, but this would have been the political power behind things. These were the movers and shakers. These were the elites. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. And in fact, he is the one who is dissenting in Luke chapter 23 from the policies and procedures of the Sanhedrin concerning Jesus. He's one of two dissenting voices. In fact, the second, I'll go ahead and give it away, is Nicodemus. But John says he was a secret disciple. Now, one might expect that that would be something negative at this point in the narrative. Especially since when we read through John, particularly in John chapter 6, we find that as Jesus gives hard teaching, some of them can't handle the hard teaching, they abandon Jesus. We move forward in the gospel, we see those who are closest to Jesus have abandoned him. Now this man who was formerly a secret disciple is now thrust into the spotlight, but I believe that God had providentially placed him exactly where he was to use him to communicate a message that was far greater than himself. So who was the other one? Now, usually when we think of Nicodemus, we think John chapter 3. We think of him somewhat of a skeptic. He tells Jesus, we know that you're a teacher sent from God. And Jesus starts telling him, well, do you really know these things? Because here's the one who's been sent, and here's the message that comes to you. And we get one of the greatest texts in all of Christian history, at least one of the most quoted, which is John 3:16, and that interchange. Says he came to Jesus by night, and we're all a little suspicious of he's sneaking around because he didn't want anybody to know. Well, that text doesn't mean that he was sneaking to meet with Jesus. That's when rabbis would be studying. They were up at night studying the Torah. This is when they would have had their times of dialogue with one another. So he comes to Jesus, showing respect to him calling him rabbi, teacher. And then Jesus corrects him, but if you're a teacher of Israel, you don't know these things. And Nicodemus is perplexed. How can a man be born twice? How can he be born again? And Jesus gives us that great passage in John chapter 3, verse 3, where he says, a man must be born from above or born again to see the kingdom of heaven. It's interesting because we find in the synoptics that they say that Joseph of Arimathea was also a man looking for the kingdom of God. God uses these two men, providentially places these two men to communicate John's message that Jesus was a king. So let's notice what the text does tell us. Joseph goes to Pilate for the body. For many of you, that seems simple. It's something you gloss over, is it not? I mean, you just go down to the morgue, you identify the body, go to the funeral home, yeah, that's so-and-so. We want them put here. No big deal, right? It was a really big deal. And if we lived in that day and time, we'd recognize how big of a deal it was. Let's take a step back. Jesus dies as a condemned criminal. Condemned criminals had their bodies thrown into a pit. They were not given an honorable burial. Their families weren't allowed to have their bodies. I think it's interesting, though, we see what's happening. We see Mary in John's gospel at the foot of the cross. She doesn't have any sort of political clout or power to go and request the body. Neither does John, who's standing there, and Jesus passes along his duties to take care of Mary to John. And John doesn't have that sort of clout. He couldn't claim the body. Mary couldn't claim the body. How could they, simple people, a fisherman, and the widow of a carpenter, go and to ask Pilate for the body of Jesus? They hadn't been providentially placed for such a mission, but God had a man. He had a man at the right place at the right time to carry out his mission, to communicate his message, and he had Joseph of Arimathea, an influential man, a rich man, a man who would have had access to Pilate. Can you imagine? It's not like you just call up and say, I would have talked to my congressman here. I'm one of your constituents. You better listen. Yeah, right. Good luck with that today anyway, but I digress. So, have that kind of clout? That kind of access? Where did he get that access? It was divinely provided. This was favor that God had provided because of his position in society, which God used for his glory. I think we just gloss over. Joseph went and asked for the body. Pilate gives him the body. That's no minor detail. This is all playing out so that we would hear this great news that would unfold at the beginning of John chapter 20, that the tomb was empty. Do you realize the discredit would have happened to the gospel? They threw his body into a pit. Now we don't know where the body is. Now suddenly we're seeing why it's important. God uses Joseph, but I want you to note something, though. And I think that there's a reason that John says secret believer for fear of the Jews. He wants to juxtapose that with Joseph's courage in this moment. His courage combined with his conviction led him to go to Pilate and provide Jesus an honorable burial. A burial fit for a king. One that recognized who he was. So Joseph goes to Pilate and asks for the body of Jesus, and Pilate grants him the body. There's another, I want you to catch this. We're going to pick this back up, but I want to start you thinking on this thread, and we're going to grab it at the end. There's a certain apologetic here flowing through the text. And for those of you who don't know what that word means, it doesn't mean we're saying we're sorry. It means defending the gospel. There are people in power, positions of influence, who are handling the body. It's not misplaced. It's not switched out. Good luck with that ridiculous theory. We have people in positions of power and influence. We can follow, in the legal world, they call it the chain of custody. If that chain of custody is broken, the evidence won't be allowed in. But we have the chain of custody for the body of Jesus from the cross to the tomb, and from the tomb to the garden, and listen, from the garden to the ascension into heaven. And we have the declaration where he sits in heaven, and we long for the final revelation where that body in its glory is manifest and shown and revealed to the world. Chain of custody was not broken. I think it's interesting. We see Joseph going and getting the body. He's handling, if you will, the legal part. Nehemiah handling the logistics. Here Nehemiah goes and gets all these spices. Now, the spices, just so you know, were used because the body would have smelled. It wouldn't take long, and the body would have had a stench. But do you notice the weight? 75 pounds, approximately. A Roman pound was about 12 ounces, so we're going to approximate here, and the translators try to do that. 100 Roman pounds. Nicodemus goes and gets these spices. Now, for many of us, we're like, well, that seems like a lot. That's not what the common person wouldn't have had access to that. We know Nicodemus must be wealthy, must be a rich man, but why so much? In 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 14, we are given just a quick glimpse of King Asa's death. And we discover the amount of spices and ointments that were used to bury a king or somebody of great value, somebody of significance or importance. In fact, when the great rabbi Gamaliel died, they used 80 pounds of spices and ointments. The original audience would have recognized that no ordinary man would have had 75 pounds of spices and perfumes dedicated to his funeral. The message Nicodemus is communicating is this is no ordinary man. This is a man worthy of the burial of a king. That's what they're providing him in this last moment, in these few moments. Time is fleeting, but they're doing everything they can to provide him the honorable burial. And I want you to juxtapose that to the burial that they would have given him, which was the burial of a condemned criminal. But God would not allow it. Every single detail carefully planned and laid out. That's why throughout the gospel we would hear Jesus saying, "My hour has not yet come," because he knew the details, all the finer points, even to that minutia, worked out, planned out to communicate the same message, the message that we still communicate today, that he is the King of Kings, that there was never one like him, and there never will be. What we see as a simple, hurried burial was in fact a proclamation that Jesus Christ was in fact a king. There's another third little thing here we don't even note. We just kind of read over. But it was a new tomb. A tomb where no one had been laid. I think that's carrying with that same theme where he rides in on the donkey where no one had ever sat. Everything carved out perfect for him, for the Holy One. It was a borrowed tomb. It was a temporary place. But it was a holy place. We do well to remember that. This follows the thread, the story that's gone all throughout the gospel, does it not? At his birth, he's proclaimed to be a king, is he not? As we move forward in the gospels, we find right before his triumphal entry that he's anointed like a king. In fact, he says, "She has saved these spices, this ointment, for my burial." He rides into Jerusalem like a king. He testifies before Pilate when he says, "Are you a king?" He says, "For this very reason I've been born. This is the reason I've come into the world." At his sentencing, he's declared a king. When Pilate says, "Shall I execute or crucify your king?" At his execution, Pilate puts above his name Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, even to their protest. He will not remove it. And at his burial, he's declared king. And certainly not ironically, but the same author, John, in Revelation 19, verse 16, says that throughout all eternity, he will be declared to be a king. There was no insignificant detail. No miscellaneous facts. Everything. And I want to remind you, everything mattered. Everything. The message is clear. Jesus is a king. Why is it important? Why does the tomb matter? Why does the burial matter? Think about it for just a moment. In Matthew's gospel, we hear that the leadership are concerned They want the tomb sealed and guarded. Let's take a step back and let's just follow the historicity of this for just a moment. The Jewish officials know where the tomb is, and they know where the body is. The Roman officials know where the body and the tomb is. Two members of the Sanhedrin know where the body and the tomb is. Two women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, witnessed where they laid him. They know where the tomb and the body is. Those are no minor details. We could say, and I feel comfortable saying this, with absolute historical certainty, we know they knew where the body was. The guards knew where the body was. They even sealed the tomb. So why does it matter? Here's why it matters. Because they'd find that same tomb empty. That's why. We don't have a resurrection without an empty tomb. And you don't have the historicity that we need for the empty tomb without these people knowing where the body was laid. So they knew where the king was. They didn't want to acknowledge him as a king. They wanted him buried as a criminal, but God would not have it. And when you take one step into the next chapter, you hear the message that will echo through eternity. That tomb was empty. In somewhat of a rush, they've got to lay his body there, but they're determined to announce to the world that he's a king. To give him an honorable burial, a burial that he was worthy of. But listen, I recognize that, humanly speaking, in their finite understanding, they thought this was it, and they were going to do everything they possibly could to bring honor and glory. But what they couldn't have known in that moment, what they couldn't have realized, was the way in which they would really bring him glory, the way in which they would truly honor him, is to exalt him as the risen Savior. And that's exactly what we'll do throughout eternity. Let me go back where I started. If we were to measure Jesus' funeral by the number of people that showed up, we'd think that he was an insignificant person. I mean, let's be honest. We would. Get what, 4 people tops? That big of an impact. But that's not how we'll measure his impact in his life. See, because the book of Revelation, also written by John, says that around the throne is a number that can't be counted, from every tribe, tongue, kindred, and people. Oh, that's how we're going to measure his impact. When we look and we hear in the halls of heaven the echoes of his praise resound as we look around and see him manifested in his full glory on display for us in eternity, we'll recognize that certainly no grave could have held him. No grave was worthy of him. He'll fill heaven with his glory, and we'll see the true impact as we look to our left and our right, and we're surrounded with myriads of angels and countless numbers of believers offering praise throughout eternity to the one who was buried as a king. Oh, until that day, may we, by God's grace, continue to proclaim the gospel of the one who died, was buried, and rose again. Let us pray.